Tonight I am excited to welcome William Powers to Harvard Bookstore to discuss his book Hamlet's Blackberry, a practical philosophy for building a good life in the digital age. Mr. Powers is a former staff writer for the Washington Post. His writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, New York Magazine, The Guardian, and other publications. He is a two-time winner of the National Press Club's Arthur Rouse Award for American Media Commentary, and he is a former Shorenstein Fellow. I should also thank the I should also thank the Shorenstein Center for Press Politics and Public Policy for co-sponsoring tonight's event. In Hamlet's Blackberry, Mr. Powers offers advice for enriching our inner and interpersonal lives in today's super-connected digital age. After showing that current concerns about the negative impact of new technology on our lives are not unprecedented, Mr. Powers outlines his own approach to balancing the need to connect with the need to contemplate. The Wall Street Journal said of the book, even a jaded reader is likely to be won over by Hamlet's Blackberry, and the New York Times said Powers' ruminations are penetrating, his language clear and strong, and historical references are restorative.
Well, I want to say that I'm so happy to be here. I've been touring for a couple weeks now, bunch of cities, West Coast and now the East Coast. This is my last stop, and it's really perfect because this is really, coming here is really a homecoming for me for a bunch of reasons. I live in Massachusetts, I live out on Cape Cod, but more to the point with this book, it really began here in Cambridge. The Shorenstein Center is not just the co-sponsor of this event, it's the place where the whole idea really started. I had a wonderful semester here looking at one piece of the puzzle that I talk about in the book, and that grew into the book, and it was really the support of the wonderful people at Shorenstein, one of whom I see in the second row here, that really made it possible. So it's great to be back where really the book was born. Speaking of the Shorenstein Center, I had a few hours before coming here tonight, a few free hours between, I had done a radio interview and I had this event, and then I have another radio interview tonight, and I had this rare break in the book tour madness, and I remembered this little space next to the building that the Shorenstein Center is in. There's sort of a path between Shorenstein and the Charles Hotel complex. And some of you probably know it. I don't think, unlike many spaces around Cambridge and Harvard, I don't think it actually has a name or had been endowed by anybody. It just is this kind of walk, and it's lovely. It has these big trees. It's kind of dark, which sort of adds a charm to it in the summer. And I went there just to sit and think about what I was going to say tonight. I sat on a bench, and it was funny. I noticed I did something that I've been doing for at least a decade and that we all seem to do, is the second I sat on the bench for this quiet time, I reached in my pocket for my mobile and took it out without even realizing why I took it out, thinking I was going to do something with it, thinking something was going to come in, some call or whatever. And I held it in my hands for a few minutes, and I started to watch the people go by, walking on bikes. It's a really nice spot. People with strollers, with babies. And I noticed, as you do notice today, that a really high percentage of the people walking by were either on a device, talking, or using their thumbs to text, or they were just holding it like I was, sort of waiting for that next summons from the beyond. And watching them, and then noticing the few exceptions who came by, the few people who really didn't have any digital gadget in their hand, were, you might say, disconnected, sort of inspired me to both turn mine off and put it back in my pocket. And I realized, looking at those exceptions, there was one woman, kind of young woman, walking along with a sort of spring in her step, carrying a couple notebooks in her hand, and God knows where she was going. She had a Radcliffe rowing shirt on. Then there was a dad, one of the dads with one of the strollers, did not have a Blackberry in his hand, which was very nice. I noticed that that person without the gadget, that sight of that person disconnected, has become a kind of extraordinary, really a singular sight, singular in two senses of the word, in our world today. And it's even taken on a kind of aesthetic quality. It's so unusual that you sort of marvel at it and think, gosh, I don't see that anymore. It's almost become, to me, like, that first sight of Yosemite Valley or Mount Everest or something. It's like, wow, that is really an exception to the landscape. And yet what's interesting about that person who's disconnected is that, I think in the cultural atmosphere in which we have been living for some time, we haven't been paying much attention to that person, that state, or thinking about the degree to which each of us is in it or not in it, sort of being conscious of the value, if any, of that state, of being without a gadget or with the gadget turned off. In a sense, I think we've been leaving that idea behind that person represents, and that's sort of behind what I decided to try and tackle in the book, which takes me back to where the book began. When I had this great opportunity to be here at the Shorenstein Center several years ago for a semester to study really anything I wanted related to the media, the topic I proposed was to look at one tool of connectedness, a very old tool that I sort of felt like the person walking without a gadget was being sort of forgotten and left behind, and that was paper. I decided to spend a semester studying paper and this assumption that paper was dying, which actually at the beginning of the semester when I started this project, I kind of bought into that idea. I sort of thought it must be true. It was completely logical. We're about to say goodbye to paper media, and they'd be completely replaced by screens. And in fact, as Nancy will remember, I named my project at the outset The Death of Paper, based on that assumption. I spent those 3 months here, 3.5 months, looking back at the past, at the history of both the tool that is paper, which is about 2,000 years old, and other technologies, sort of the history of human connectedness. And I wound up actually changing my mind. I wound up concluding that that it often is the case that old tools that we assume are going to die when a new one comes along that's supposedly going to replace them don't die, that they're often not replaced, that they live on because they have these unacknowledged or initially unacknowledged strengths, or that they take on new roles. And I concluded, based on a lot of factors that I'm not going to recount here because it would take too long, that paper has all these strengths that are actually in some ways becoming more valuable the more connected we get by digital screens. Some of them are cognitive, psychological, emotional. Some of them have to do with just the three-dimensional nature of paper and the fact that we can hold it in our hands and feel it with our fingers. It seems like a seemingly trivial thing, but it actually isn't trivial. There's a lot of research suggesting that embodied tools that are three-dimensional like us, are easier on the mind in certain ways than digital screens are. So I wrote this up and concluded that paper will endure in some fashion forever, really. And I called the essay Hamlet's Blackberry because I had touched on a moment in Shakespeare in the essay, Why Paper is Eternal, which was sort of a provocative title I later learned when people started writing about it. It got some nice attention in the media, and people were downloading it and reading it on the Shorenstein's website, and I got some offers from publishers to turn it into a book, sort of some feelers. Do you want to just expand this essay into a book about paper? And I concluded two things. On a practical level, I concluded that a book specifically about the future of paper would have about 100 readers. But on a much more important level, I felt that I had sort of said my piece about that subject and that there was a much larger question that I might be able to look at in a book, which is what I call in the book the conundrum of connectedness, this larger issue of all the wonderful benefits we're getting from digital devices, which are so many and so manifest every day. It's hard to even sort of begin a list to describe all the things we get from being able to reach out to so many people, so much information, so easily with a few touches of a keypad. It's stunning. It's still stunning to me 2 decades into this age, this digital age, that we can do all those things. That's one side of the conundrum, the good side. But I think in recent years, there's been a downside that's been emerging, and it was that made this a conundrum and that made me want to explore it in a book. The downside being, to put it as simply as possible, that all this connectedness, all this wonderful connectedness, is just making our lives busier and more crowded and more hectic, and not leaving us what I call at one point in the book stopping places for the mind, places where we can sort of do what I was doing on that pathway today, sit on that bench and reflect, make sense of our connectedness, take it inward. You know, when we connect, we're basically reaching outward and living what philosophers for centuries have called the outward life. But they've also emphasized the inward life and the importance of the two being in balance. And I had a hunch that, our our inner life was out of balance, was being somewhat overlooked in the enthusiasm about digital technology. And I also had a hunch that it might be useful, having spent that time at Shorenstein looking at the past, it might be useful to go back into the past again for this larger question. I felt that in the contemporary landscape, there weren't any answers to this question that were really useful to me. There were two schools of thought in the books and articles that are written about sort of the challenges of digital life and digital life generally. On the one side, there's sort of the technophiles, the people who write these kind of cheerleading books about we're remaking the world and it's all fantastic, and they're actually right. You know, those books are correct. We are remaking the world, and it is wonderful. Those techno writers tend to write for each other, I have found, in language that is often kind of hard to penetrate for the rest of us. And they also don't seem to be aware of or care much about the downside that I was facing. On the other side of it, the other part of the dialogue that's been taking place for years now is the people who can't bear the devices, who think civilization is coming apart, our brains are being destroyed, and so forth by digital technology, which I also don't find sympathetic. I just don't think that it's the end of the world because we've learned to connect better. I think it's really the beginning of a great new chapter, and we just need to figure out a smart strategy for using these technologies. So I did what a lot of writers have done with their first book. This is my first book, hopefully not my last. I decided to write the book that I wanted to read, that nobody had written, which is kind of examining this conundrum for the rest of us, for those of us who are not in either camp, which I had a hunch was actually most people. So having been frustrated with the contemporary landscape, I looked into the past. I started reading a lot of thinkers from different points in history when technology was changing the landscape of everyday life, and got all kinds of recommendations from friends. I really cast a wide net, and I read lots of people. At one point, I spent a lot of time. It was funny, the project sort of kept taking me back to Cambridge for some reason. It was like there's this energy under the sidewalk here that was connected to my book. At one point, I spent a lot of time in the 19th century reading three people who were really interconnected in their lives and in their thinking: Emerson, Thoreau, and William James. And I kept coming across these fantastic moments in all three of those thinkers that I also had to wonder, was it all because they lived in Cambridge and somehow got this same juice that I got? I didn't wind up using them all, focusing on them, all three of them in the book, but there was one moment in, as you all know, I think, Emerson, Thoreau, and James all kind of had this overriding theme about the significance and the potential of the self apart from the crowd. Really an emphasis on this kind of this inner power that we all have, that we need a little distance to tap into. And there was this wonderful moment that I came across in Emerson that maybe some of you will recognize. It's from one of the essays, I can't remember which, where he's actually just talking about his state of mind one random day walking along. I don't know if it was in Cambridge or Concord or where it was, but he wrote, "Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a special good exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear." I love that moment. I especially love his adding that little brink of fear at the end to remind you that he's not just writing about something that was all pleasure. But I also love it because he was just writing about one of these empty moments when he wasn't doing anything in particular, when you might say in our terms he wasn't connecting, he wasn't stimulating himself, he was just walking along. And yet it had this enormous power. And then, not long after that, I was reading William James, an essay about how to find, it's an incredible essay that had a great impact on me, called On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings. And it's about how difficult it is sometimes to recognize what it is in other people that makes their lives significant, and how we tend to wall ourselves off from other people. So not only do we not tap into that inner self, but we prevent ourselves. We put up these walls that make it almost impossible to see that inner significance. And I'm reading along in William James, and he quotes that very sentence in Emerson about crossing the bare common, and that incredible ability of Emerson to see vital significance in these moments that others would overlook because they seem empty. It may be significant that Emerson was William James's godfather, so maybe he read him more closely than most people. But anyway, I loved all the synergies between those writers. I wound up choosing 7 moments in the past that I thought had interesting parallels to today. Moments, generally, 6 out of the 7 were moments when society was adjusting to some new technology and sort of having trouble adjusting to it. And when people were facing a challenge that reminded me of this conundrum that we're facing. Wonderful benefits, new burdens and downsides. How do you reconcile them? And I chose, for each of those moments, one thinker who seemed to have unusually practical ideas that we could apply to our own lives. So of the 3 I mentioned, for example, I focused on Thoreau, because Thoreau is sort of like applied Emerson in a way. And William James is wonderful, but completely abstract and theoretical, and very hard to, when you come away from reading him, it's hard to say sort of what you got out of it, even though it's really important. But with Thoreau, it's right there. It's in everyday life, and that's what I wanted in this book. That's why it's called A Practical Philosophy. So just a couple examples. I started with Plato and the birth of the alphabet, and I used the famous dialogue Phaedrus, which is about Socrates and his young student Phaedrus taking a walk outside Athens and putting some space between themselves and the busy life of the city to have a conversation. Socrates is very skeptical about the value of leaving the city. He hates to leave behind his so-called, what I would call his connected life. In the oral sense of the word, conversation, he believed was, of course, the great route to wisdom. But his friend convinces him to take this walk, and they have a conversation for the ages. And I use that to talk about the simple principle of putting a little distance between yourself and the crowd. Moving ahead to the Roman Empire, I focused on Seneca, a philosopher who I hadn't really read before I worked on this book, and who I think has been kind of cast aside in the last 100 years or so. I think he used to be actually really widely read, and he's now known as a source of a couple aphorisms, and that's about it. And I found Seneca to be an incredible treasure trove of writing and thought that I could actually like sit up in bed and not be able to sleep. I was so engrossed in some of his writing that felt like it was written not 2,000 years ago, but last week. He talks about, Seneca was a very busy man. He was effectively the emperor of Rome for 5 years under Nero, when Nero was too young to rule. And Seneca was basically running the empire. And he was also a thinker. And he talks about the challenge in that busy era of Rome, when information was sort of cascading down on people through this wonderful new medium of books and written language, which was only 400 years old at that point. And he talks about how his friends and colleagues had such a horrible time feeling like they could never keep up with all the information, could never get ahead of it. It was almost as if the burdens of connectedness were chasing them everywhere they went. And he refers to it at one point as the restless energy of the hunted mind. I love that phrase because it has these two elements that I think we're experiencing today: the restless energy, that inability to kind of settle down, to want to move to another task and another task, sort of like the finger on the clicker. And then the hunted mind, that feeling of being pursued by the inbox that I feel all the time these days. Another example of a thinker I looked at is the one who gave me the title, Shakespeare. I focused there on a moment in Hamlet that I talked about in the essay I wrote for the Shorenstein Center, but I come at it in a slightly different way, talking about a gadget that was very popular in Shakespeare's time called a table, which was a little sort of booklet that people started carrying around, that when you opened the covers, it had a surface made of plaster that you wrote on with a stylus, a metal stylus, like the styluses we have with some of our gadgets today. And the beauty of the table was that you could erase it in the evening. You could take notes all the day, do your to-do list, things you wanted to remember, and then wipe it clean very easily, which was a complete innovation. People became so dependent on their tables in Renaissance Europe that Montaigne and other writers wrote in their journals and in their letters that they couldn't go anywhere without them, that they were completely hooked, really, on their tables. And Shakespeare gives one in Hamlet to Hamlet himself when he first sees the ghost of his father and is sort of inundated with this barrage of information that he doesn't know what to do with, learning that his father was murdered rather than killed by a serpent. He says suddenly, my tables, my tables. He reaches for the gadget. And he takes it out and expressly says that he's using it to clear the clutter from this distracted globe, by which he means his head. Although he's also punning on the word and referring to the Globe Theater, where the play would have taken place, suggesting perhaps that people in his time were suffering from ADD, just as we are. Anyway, that example is sort of, I use it for a couple of different reasons, but the primary reason is to show that people have been through this cycle before with technology, both coming along and changing their lives and presenting these challenges, and also providing answers. In this case, a new technology that really helped people deal with overload. The final example is Thoreau, who, as I said, I chose from those 3 19th century thinkers that I loved. And I kind of try and do a little corrective exercise with Thoreau, who we think of as the guy who ran away from society and was really an escapee. But I, in reading quite a bit about Thoreau and reading him again, and by the way, I couldn't stand him when I read him in college, but I pulled out my old Thoreau that I read here at Harvard, and my 20-something-year-old marginal notes were all completely negative. I wrote in the margins, pretentious, stupid, and now I came back to him in my 40s, and I just saw this wonderful new view. I got this wonderful new view of Thoreau. I realized that he wasn't really running away from the crowd. He built his cabin on the periphery of Concord. It was a short walk away. The railroad, one of the great symbols of connectedness, had just been built from Concord to Boston, and it ran right by Walden Pond, and as you probably know, still does today. And he actually writes in Walden, there's all these passages about all the company he kept and the entertaining he did in the cabin. At one point, he entertained as many as 30 people. What I wanted people to know about Thoreau is that what he was actually trying to do was not run away, but conduct an experiment about how to offset the intense connectedness of one's life in the modern world with a little disconnectedness, bring some of this balance, open up some gaps between himself and the crowd so he could have these kinds of moments and an inner life, a rich inner life, like the one I'm trying to talk about in the book as an important value that we seem to be leaving behind. The other thing that's great about Thoreau is there's this wonderful moment where he talks about how addicted people were to the post office, to going to the post office. And it's not that well known because it's not in Walden. It's in one of his speeches that later was turned into an essay. And I love this passage. I'm just going to read this to you. He talks about people who were addicted to their connectedness in that age. He doesn't use that phrase, connectedness, but that's what he's talking about. Wind up sort of skating the surface of life, living superficially, never going deep. And he talks about what happens sort of when they run into each other. Surface meets surface. When our life ceases to be inward and private, conversation degenerates into mere gossip. In proportion as our inward life fails, we go more constantly and desperately to the post office. You may depend on it that the poor fellow who walks away with the greatest number of letters, proud of his extensive correspondence, has not heard from himself this long while. I love that. I had so many moments like that reading these people that I initially wrote the book not telling the life stories of the philosophers. My first draft was just drawing on their ideas, and then I realized I had to go back and talk about their lives because I just felt so connected to them after realizing there were all these parallels to our time. So that's the sort of the middle part of the book, the meat. And then in the last part of the book, I take the ideas that I've gathered from these thinkers and I try to apply them to everyday situations. It's very, it's just meant to be suggestive. I really tried to make the book not prescriptive or preachy. Everybody's life is different. I just wanted to sort of throw out examples. I really wanted to just raise consciousness and let people try and use the same ideas to figure out their own solutions. But what it really comes down to is this idea of trying to achieve a better balance and the notion that connectedness and wonderful technologies like these that we have today serve us best when they're offset by the opposite force, when they're offset by a little disconnectedness, a little space, a little gap between yourself and in this case, the digital crowd. And in the end, I have a chapter that's really sort of about the biggest experiment that my family has done we realized, actually before I even embarked on this project, my wife and I were realizing that our family life was really suffering from the screen addiction that we all were feeling. My son was 8 or 9 at the time. We have just one child. And my wife and I both work at home, so we have home offices with screens. And I found that in the evenings after dinner, we would try to gather to have family time in the living room, and we would do what I came to think of as the vanishing family trick. One by one, we would peel off on some flimsy excuse. I have to go check something. I need a glass of water. And we were all going, where we were all going. We were all going back to the screen and really abandoning each other, abandoning this life that we had built together in this home and this family life that meant so much to us, supposedly, but somehow we were discounting it and deciding on this other force and the pull of the crowd. So my wife and I decided that we wanted to do something about it. So we just started this completely ad hoc experiment, inspired by nobody, but just nothing but the thought that the traditional weekend, the idea of a traditional weekend, we would disconnect the modem on Friday nights, the household modem that served all our computers, and leave it unplugged until Monday morning. And we would see what it was like to be offline 2 days a week. Well, I can tell you, it was unbelievably hard. This was over 3 years ago now that we started, and the first couple months were really, particularly the first few weekends, were incredibly painful, like pure withdrawal that I imagine a heroin addict must go through. And I'm probably diminishing the pain of being a heroin addict there, but it was quite remarkable, and it convinced us that we were onto something, that we really needed to do this. The very first weekend, we were so discombobulated, it really kind of had overtones of like an existential crisis, like we didn't know who we were anymore because we couldn't go to the inbox, really, and surf the net. At one point, we decided we were going to relieve the pain by going to a movie that night. We told our son, who was yelling, "Bring back the internet," that we would go to take him to a movie that night at a cinema. And then we all started making for our screens to look up the movie listings. And we realized we couldn't, and then we remembered that movie listings used to be in newspapers, but we weren't sure if we knew that they were still there. And we also had lost the knack for finding them, so we started circling the pile of newspapers to see if we could remember how to do that. But the good news about this ritual of ours, as I recount in the book, is that after a couple months, it really started to become very natural and effortless even. And after a while, we began to realize, in both senses of the word realize, that we were really gaining a huge amount, that we were going back to this other space that matters hugely that we don't talk about. And it's really kind of that space that those people were in who walked by me without their gadgets today on the path. It's just that place where you can have your own thoughts, where you're not, where your moments are not contingent on the beyond, and where eye contact came back. It was just a different kind of consciousness. It's amazing. I kept wishing, in writing that part of the book, I kept wishing I was William James and had his facility for describing states of consciousness, which I don't. But I did my best in my own prosaic way to get at it, because I think it's really, really important, and that everybody should think about it and try and come at it in their own way. Our ritual, which we call the Internet Sabbath, is not going to be for everybody. There are people who work on weekends. There are people who have all kinds of schedules for which it would never be possible. But I do think there's a way in which everyone can try something of this nature to bring a little balance to their lives, even if it's just an hour a day or a few hours a week as a start. Because I can promise, and I try and convey this in the book, that the benefits are absolutely fantastic. And I think that if you come at it with a belief that it's worthwhile, that there's a positive goal at the end of the tunnel, which is what the philosophers, one of the reasons I have the philosophers is to show people, to kind of ground this principle in history and in the past and in what other people have been through before. If you have that belief, it's easier to kind of follow through with it, because you're pursuing something that's tremendously valuable. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. So the question is, what spiritual influences did I have in writing the book, right? We are not a particularly religious family in the classic sense, but I think that my wife and I are both spiritual, and we read a lot and think a lot and sort of have our own grazing that we do in different traditions that's very valuable. Reading for the book that I did was much broader than what I described. I actually read a lot of spiritual thought, people like Thomas Merton, Eastern philosophers who really talk a lot about solitude and the value of rituals like this one that occur in different fashions all through all traditions. I wound up not using overtly spiritual thought in the book much because I kept trying to quote Merton actually, but it just was not working. Because I really wanted the book to be incredibly inclusive for anyone who might read it and actually to feel really practical. And once you start quoting Thomas Merton, of whom I'm a massive fan, you really move very quickly away from kind of everyday life, where I wanted the book to be very grounded. And I thought if this book is successful and I have a chance to write another one, that would be the place to go. So, and both of them, both Emerson, the question was really about Emerson as opposed to Thoreau, but both of them having these rituals. And, both of them walking was a real theme, and they walked together, of course, a lot, and they also walked with others. And walking is a huge theme for both of them. I want to read the epigraph because you referred to it, and other people might not know it. It's on a little different theme, but it's basically, this is from Emerson. "This time, like all times, is a very good one, if we but know what to do with it." And that is from a lecture that he gave here in Cambridge, actually. And I really wanted to use that because I wanted the book to be upbeat and to be, I really felt in looking at the history of technology that the pessimists always wind up being wrong. I mean, I couldn't find a time when the pessimists weren't wrong. There's a hilarious quote in here about someone who 15 years after Gutenberg, an Italian scholar, said he had such incredible hopes for this thing, the book, and it's been such a disaster because anybody can now say anything they want and it gets distributed all over the world. And that's what a lot of these anti-digital people say all the time. It's just a shame that people can just say all these outrageous things and there's no control over what they say. It's the same argument. So anyway, that's the optimism. But I think that, and that's a great question, sort of about the scholarly world and the need now to be up every day on everything, right? Which is a new challenge. But I think that it's dawning on us that this is happening to all of us, not just scholars, but everyone has this new burden of every moment there's something new that is available to you and you might need for your work or for your personal life, how to decide when to check, really. And I think that it's dawning on us that we need to decide and we need to work out, I'm using this word rituals over and over again, but habits that help us do that. I didn't talk about this, but there's a section in the book about how businesses are wrestling with this and trying to get employees to have disconnected time because they're realizing they're losing money. The bottom line is suffering from all this distractedness of the employees. When you're toggling from screen to screen to task to Facebook to Twitter to this and that at an office and trying to do your work, and when your employer has told you to use Facebook and Twitter because they're the new tools and you have no choice, you wind up not getting a lot done. And these tools of efficiency wind up being tools of inefficiency. And the good news is that the technology companies are leading the way in studying this issue because their employees are the most connected of all. So I recount some of that in the book. Yeah, it's really true. When I was in Washington just 2 days ago for my visits there about the book, I stayed with a friend who graduated from Harvard in the class of 43, 40 years ahead of me. And he was talking about this same thing, and he said, it's weird. I keep thinking back on a lot of the stuff I learned. He had to read ancient Greek while here. He had to, and Latin. And he said he picked up all kinds of tips that are helping him figure out this question now on the verge of age 90 to sort of get through the challenge. And so it's wonderful you're making the same point. Thank you. And, we called it the Internet Sabbath totally on our own. And then we realized friends, when we told them about it, started sending us clips and things people had written, and there were even organizations, people doing the very same thing and calling it that. So it's one of those kind of convergences that's occurring at all different places as the same truth dawns on people that we need something like this. Yeah, well, there were two risks. It sort of cut both ways. I knew that in even using the word philosophy on the cover, and which my editor and I talked about a lot, that there was a potential of alienating people. But I felt if I put the word practical, that would help. And I also really tried to write it simply and clearly. And I was thrilled when the New York Times said that about the writing, because that really was my goal, to make it really, none of that. One writer I love called it the squid spray of academics, that need to obfuscate in order to seem like you're smarter than you are, which so many academics unfortunately do out of insecurity, I think. I really tried to go in the other way, in the other direction, but I also knew I was running the risk of being criticized by the people who really, and I think I will be actually, it hasn't happened yet, by the people who really are the experts on philosophers, which I'm not, who I'm sure are going to loathe this book because, I'm not speaking their language at all. But it hasn't happened yet, so. So the questions about the technological emphasis of the technology and the way that manifests itself in our own communications. Yeah, that's really true. And is often influenced too much by the technology. Yeah, I have a little insight to share on that. I'm using Twitter to try and publicize the book. I got a Twitter account, and I'm using my own special approach to that, which is 1 tweet per day, Monday through Friday, which just sort of runs against the way you're supposed to use Twitter, supposedly. But I actually love doing it because I get to think about my tweet all day and try and make it really good. But what I noticed on Twitter is I started following on Twitter. You might not all know this. You get to do these messages that are 140 characters, that maximum 140 characters. So they're very short messages. You can do as many as you want, and they go out to people who have decided to follow you, who are other Twitter people, and then you can follow people and get their stream of messages. So I immediately started following people who struck me as interesting for various reasons. I started following somebody called Philosophy Tweets because he was tweeting just about the thinkers, of the past. But I noticed that a lot of these people I started following, not Philosophy Tweets, but some of the others, so much of the content was about, did you see that story about the iPad and what's up with Verizon and their disaster? And it was all about the tools. And they weren't people, I checked in some of their little profiles, they weren't people who even necessarily worked in the industry. They just are, I guess they call themselves often gadget heads, I guess that's a particular calling for some people, but I'm starting to unfollow those people. And by the way, I've been thinking back on the television age and my childhood in the television age, and I don't remember people running around all day saying, boy, RCA versus Motorola, what a battle, but somehow it is today the obsession. It's very interesting. So the question is, paper enabled a kind of solitude, a kind of mode of thinking that digital devices don't seem to want to do, and is the next generation going to find those spaces to think? I'm embarrassed. Your question really makes me realize that I skipped over a huge part of talking about my essay that I wrote here that led to the book, because it really was about that idea of paper giving you that space, that solitude as a place away from the digital sphere, and that is the emerging value of paper that's so far largely unacknowledged. Although the reaction to my essay was such that it gave me hope that other people are starting to think that way. On the younger generation, in the couple of weeks I've been touring around talking about the book, I have had a surprising thing happen, which has given me great optimism. Which is the people who come up to me and talk to me most excitedly often at events like this about the book are the people under 35 who, I'm not saying all of them, but there is something brewing in that generation. I can feel it in their remarks. And often they say to me that they're fascinated by the idea of the book, and they came because they heard me on NPR or something, because they'd never heard anybody saying this before. It's not even like something that was brought up as a possibility. And it's dawning on them, gosh, maybe I am missing something, because I'm a digital native. I know nothing but this world. And is there some missing piece? So I have found that, I don't know that what percentage of people, it is self-selected people who came to hear me, so maybe not representative, but I have found it hopeful. Yeah, well, you're making a great point. One of the things we love about our Internet Sabbath is it's back to voice on the weekend. And we've told, when we started, we told friends, if you want to reach us on the weekend, we're not going to get the email, but call. And there's actually this weird awkwardness now with voice communication. With the young, it has a nice dimension, I think, which is that they think of it as a manners issue, that it's actually more intrusive to call someone and demand that they talk to you right in the moment. We didn't grow up thinking that way. In fact, we grew up in a world in which I did anyway, when the phone rang, you ran to answer it like a slave until voicemail came along. So I kind of like that they have that. It is a way in which, the etiquette has changed, and it's got a nice element to it, but it is discounting a wonderful aspect of connectedness that I think they're not enjoying to the extent that they could. The New York Times had a recent front page story about this, the decline of the voice. in the use of mobile devices. It was fascinating. And it is the young, we tend to focus on the young because they're the digital natives and so forth, but everyone is moving away from voice, and I don't know that it's going to be permanent. A lot of these periods that I looked at, there was then a sort of a pushback, and people realized, wait a minute, this is still, in Shakespeare's time, there was a sense that handwriting was dying out by some futurists of the time, if you will, futurists. And in fact, handwriting had a huge explosion and became more popular and important than ever in the age of print. So you can't really predict. Yeah, the question is, in the younger people today, there's a less likelihood of encountering strangers and having those random, I guess you would say, encounters that can lead down wonderful paths. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah, it's really true. I have noticed, if I may be presumptuous, in your generation, a kind of a social awkwardness about meeting someone by chance and you don't know them, and there's kind of a less openness, generally speaking, I think, which is too bad. I have just also noticed in my own experience in a digital world, when you move through the world and actually consciously try to leave yourself open to those encounters, how much more exciting they become because they've become so exceptional. I had one right outside the door here, just as I was arriving. I was walking along. I had shut my phone off so I couldn't be checking that, and I had put my own Hamlet's tables back in my pocket. So I wasn't looking at anything. I was walking along, and I was noticing this beautiful baby coming at me in a stroller. And I was really looking at the baby and thinking, God, what a great baby. I wish I'd had more babies, and I only had one. And the baby suddenly dropped her bottle on the sidewalk. And I got to pick it up and give it to the parents and have this nice moment that wasn't actually even a verbal exchange. We just sort of smiled and acknowledged each other. But it was a great moment. And it was like the Emerson and the Bear Common and the snow puddles. It was like something that had no words but was wonderful. And it would not have happened if I hadn't just put myself in that state where I could have an encounter with a stranger, because I was present. I was right here. And we're not right here so much of the time anymore. We're sort of not showing up for our lives because of overusing these gadgets and letting them lead us around. So, thank you. Thanks all for coming.